She ruled the neighborhood with fear, until the night she brought a gas can to the wrong driveway. What happens when a petty tyrant crosses the line, and someone finally stands up? This isn't just a story about HOA power gone too far. It's about justice, courage, and the end of control through fear. Speech balloon comment below, where are you watching from? If this shook you, like, share, and subscribe, and don't forget to ring the bell for more powerful real-life drama. Part 1. The fire she couldn't start. The flame hovered just inches from destruction. Marla Kensington's hand trembled slightly as she held the lighter near the edge of the hood. The scent of gasoline clung to the summer air, its sharp tang mixing with the quiet stillness of Cedar Glen, a neighborhood that prized appearances above all else. Her tailored linen blouse glowed softly under the street lamp, but her eyes, sharp and cold, reflected nothing but control. Or at least, the illusion of it. Across the street, Ethan Reed stood behind the screen of his front door, unmoving. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't surprised. He was prepared. His black sedan sat in the driveway, now streaked with fuel. Marla had poured it along the side with mechanical calm, as if issuing another HOA violation. But this wasn't a warning note or a passive-aggressive email. This was criminal. And this time, she had made a mistake. Ethan's phone was already recording, tucked against the glass. He had caught it all, the gas can, the lighter, her expression. The mask she wore around the rest of Cedar Glen had slipped when she thought no one was watching. She realized it just a moment too late. As she struck the lighter and a flame hissed to life, Ethan threw the front door open. "Drop it," he said, voice calm, commanding. Marla froze, her spine rigid. For a moment, neither of them moved. Her silhouette framed by the porch light, his shadow stretching toward her across the lawn. "You don't belong here," she said, almost with conviction, as if saying it enough would make it true. Ethan stepped forward. "And you just made sure you don't either." He held up the phone. Its screen lit her face with undeniable evidence. For the first time in the months since she began her campaign to drive him out of Cedar Glen, Marla looked unsure. Then, without another word, she turned and ran. The lighter clattered onto the pavement. Ethan didn't chase her. He crouched beside his car, snapped a few photos of the fuel, the evidence, the scorched lighter. Then he straightened, breathing in the moment, not with triumph, but clarity. He had dealt with corruption before. But Marla Kensington? She was different. She wore her power like perfume, intoxicating from afar, suffocating up close. But this time, she'd gone too far. And Ethan knew exactly who to call. Not the local police. Someone who didn't care about neighborhood gossip or homeowner committees. Someone who would deal with Marla the way the law should. Part 2, the calm before the collapse. The sun had just begun to stretch its golden fingers over Cedar Glen when Ethan Reed stepped onto his porch, a steaming cup of black coffee in hand. The air was crisp, the silence thick with tension. Birds chirped on schedule. Sprinklers clicked on across manicured lawns. But beneath the facade of suburban peace, something had shifted. The gasoline from the night before had already evaporated, leaving only faint streaks on the concrete, a whisper of what had nearly happened. Ethan's car sat undisturbed, thanks to his quiet intervention. And his phone? Still gripped in his other hand, screen aglow with the evidence that would undo everything Marla Kensington had built. He didn't need to knock on a neighbor's door or raise his voice on social media. He'd made one quiet call the night before, to someone outside the Cedar Glen echo chamber. Someone who didn't care how many years Marla had ruled the HOA, how many committee meetings she'd hijacked, or how many residents she'd intimidated with bylaws and veiled threats. At precisely 6:47 a.m., two matte black SUVs rolled silently down the street. Ethan stepped back into the shadow of his porch, sipping his coffee, watching as the neighborhood slowly woke up around him. Windows cracked open. Curtains twitched. Garden hoses were paused mid-spray. People knew something was coming. They just didn't know what. The vehicles came to a halt in front of Marla Kensington's pristine brick home, the one with the ornamental fountain, the flag hung at regulation height, and the lawn trimmed to HOA perfection. The doors opened with quiet precision. 3 men stepped out, each dressed in dark suits, earpieces coiled behind their ears, movements efficient and rehearsed. These weren't local cops. These were federal agents. Agent Callahan, the lead, strode to Marla's door and knocked. It was not a neighborly tap. It was the kind of knock that made you sit up straight, authoritative, final. No response. He knocked again, harder. Ethan could imagine it clearly, Marla standing just beyond the door, arms crossed, calculating. Spinning excuses, gauging her chances. She'd survived many challenges with a smile and a threat of legal action. But this wasn't someone she could bully with HOA codes. "Mrs. Kensington, we have a warrant. Open the door." The words rang out down the street like a starter's pistol. Neighbors stepped onto porches, clutching robes and mugs. Some raised their phones. Some whispered to one another. Others, those who had once whispered about Marla's grip on the neighborhood but never dared act, simply stared. There was a pause. Then the doorknob turned slowly. And Marla Kensington emerged. She was dressed to impress, as always, tailored slacks, ivory blouse, every strand of hair in place. But her eyes betrayed her. There was no smugness. No rehearsed grin. Just the flicker of something unfamiliar, fear. Agent Callahan held up the warrant. "Marla Kensington, you are under arrest for attempted arson and criminal trespass. You have the right to remain silent." Ethan heard the rest, but he wasn't listening. He was watching Marla. Watching the moment she realized this wasn't going to disappear. Her lips parted, then twisted. "This is absurd," she snapped, her voice rising. "I'm the president of this community, of the entire HOA. Do you have any idea who I am?" Callahan didn't blink. "Yes, ma'am." "Turn around." Marla's gaze darted across the street, scanning for allies, for anyone to come to her rescue. Her eyes landed on Ethan. "You," she hissed. "You did this." Ethan didn't move. He stood just outside his doorway, arms crossed. "I told you this wasn't over," he said calmly. Marla's face darkened. "This is harassment. He doesn't belong here and everyone knows it." She turned toward the crowd that had gathered, waiting for the nods of support, the murmurs of agreement she'd grown used to. Silence. A few people shuffled awkwardly. A couple turned away. One woman, who'd once been fined for her mailbox color, held up her phone and kept recording. Marla's voice cracked, barely concealing the desperation. "You're really just going to let this happen? After everything I've done for this place?" But Cedar Glen had changed. The fear she once used as fuel no longer held power. Agent Callahan stepped forward, cuffs in hand. The cold click echoed through the quiet like a judge's gavel. Marla's hands were pulled behind her back. Her mouth opened again, but no sound came out. Ethan stepped down from his porch and approached slowly. He stopped a few feet away, gaze level. "You thought you were untouchable," he said quietly. He tilted his head. "Now you know better." And as Marla was led to the SUV, still struggling to maintain control over a situation that had long slipped away, Ethan watched. Not with joy. But with relief. Because Cedar Glen didn't belong to Marla Kensington anymore. It belonged to its people again. Part 3. The fall echoes loudest in silence the next morning. Cedar Glen was no longer just a well-manicured suburban enclave. It was a headline. Local news crews camped on Marla Kensington's immaculate lawn, trampling her flower beds as their tripods dug into the soil she'd once demanded be kept within HOA regulations. Satellite vans idled by the curb, their antennas stretching toward the sky. For years, Marla had worked to make Cedar Glen look perfect. Now, it was national news for being anything but. Ethan Reed sat at his kitchen table, coffee in hand, the morning broadcast playing on his laptop. A familiar voice echoed through the speakers. Marla Kensington, longtime head of the Cedar Glen Homeowners Association, was taken into federal custody early this morning. She faces charges of attempted arson and criminal trespass. The arrest follows a video that appears to show Kensington pouring gasoline on a resident's vehicle and preparing to set it ablaze. The footage cut to a neighbor, Brian Latham, standing awkwardly in his driveway. She always liked control, Brian admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. I think we all knew she took things a little far, but, setting someone's car on fire? That's crazy. Ethan sighed. A little far was an understatement. For months, Marla had weaponized her position. Fines for mailbox colors. Threats over garden gnomes. Anonymous complaints that somehow always resulted in inspectors and citations. She'd built a private kingdom under the guise of order and civility, and she'd ruled with an iron clipboard. But now, her throne was empty. And not everyone was ready to admit they liked the way it had felt. The news segment cut to another resident, Tricia Crane, arms folded tightly in front of her house. I just think this is all being blown out of proportion, she huffed. Marla worked hard to keep this neighborhood beautiful. She protected our standards. Now some outsider moves in and everything gets turned upside down. Ethan let out a dry chuckle. There it was. Even now, some couldn't, or wouldn't, see the difference between control and community. They preferred order at any cost, even if it meant enabling someone who ruled by intimidation. But something had changed. He could feel it. That afternoon, a new email landed in his inbox. The subject line read, HOA leadership transition, immediate changes effective. Ethan opened it and read the first few lines. His lips twitched into a quiet smile. Marla Kensington had been officially removed from the Cedar Glen HOA. An interim board was being formed. A formal election would be held in 60 days. He leaned back in his chair and looked out the window. Cedar Glen looked the same. Trimmed hedges, symmetrical houses, sun-glinted windshields, but the air felt lighter. The pressure he hadn't realized he'd been carrying was gone. The reign of Marla Kensington was over. That evening, Ethan stood on his front porch again, the light fading across the street. He was adjusting a small planter box when movement caught his eye. A discreet package rested on his doormat. No return label. No stamp. Just a slim white box. He bent down, picked it up, and opened it carefully. Inside was a neatly folded Cedar Glen HOA membership form, a sticky note attached that read, membership optional, but welcome, neighbor. Interim board. Ethan stared at it for a long moment. Then he smiled. He walked inside, tore the form cleanly in half, and dropped it into the trash. The next day, as the media frenzy began to fade, more stories emerged. Residents who had been silent under Marla's watchful eye now began to speak up. Elaine Torres, who'd been fined twice for planting native wildflowers instead of HOA-approved shrubs, stepped forward with photos and documents showing years of targeted behavior. Frank Bellamy, a retired teacher, admitted he had once been threatened with legal action over a small wind chime his granddaughter had made for him. And Claire Maddox, a mother of two, revealed that after refusing to sign up for Marla's unofficial, voluntary improvement tax, she'd been reported multiple times for unsightly toys in her yard, one of which was a child-sized picnic table. The stories poured out like water breaching a cracked dam. And behind every complaint, every threat, every fine, was the same name, Marla Kensington. But this time, people weren't whispering. They were speaking, clearly, firmly, and finally. Back at the station, the footage of Marla's arrest had become a cautionary loop on local news. Do you know who I am? she had barked at the federal agents. "Yes, ma'am," they had answered, unimpressed. The clip was replayed again and again. And every time it aired, Ethan noticed the same moment, the instant when Marla turned to the crowd, expecting support, only to be met with silence. That silence had been louder than any handcuffs. Because it meant the people of Cedar Glen no longer feared her. In the weeks that followed, small but visible changes rippled through the neighborhood. The family on Birch Lane painted their shutters red. Someone installed a porch swing without submitting paperwork. A teenager began mowing lawns for neighbors without being told he was violating noise ordinances. Freedom, it turned out, wasn't messy. It was hopeful. It was human. It was long overdue. And for the first time in years, Cedar Glen belonged to its residents, not its ruler. Part 4, the war she couldn't win. Long before the handcuffs clicked around Marla Kensington's wrists, she had already declared war. It didn't begin with gasoline. It started weeks earlier, with subtle moves. Strategic jabs disguised as neighborhood concern. And Ethan Reed saw each one for what it was, calculated retaliation. The first strike came 2 days after Ethan publicly challenged Marla at a community meeting. He'd calmly questioned a budget discrepancy, where HOA dues were going, and why so much was being allocated to administrative enforcement. Marla had smiled politely, then pivoted the discussion to landscaping violations. The next morning, a city inspector appeared at Ethan's door. Anonymous tip, the man said, clipboard in hand. Unpermitted renovations. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "I haven't touched a thing." The inspector shrugged. "Won't take long." Of course, nothing was found. But the message was clear. Days later, a sanitation officer arrived. Someone had reported excessive trash accumulation. Ethan's bins were empty, lined and clean. Then came the signs. Laminated notices posted overnight on his lawn reading, "This property is in violation, pending review." They weren't official. They weren't legal. But to neighbors passing by, they were suggestive enough to cast doubt. Marla never delivered these herself. She didn't have to. Her presence hovered behind every action like smoke, thick and choking, but hard to pin down. Ethan could have packed up and left. Others had. But he wasn't built that way. He'd spent years in federal prosecution, handling complex fraud cases, dismantling criminal networks one document at a time. People like Marla were familiar. Those who built empires out of intimidation, masking their insecurities behind rules and rhetoric. They all had the same flaw: they underestimated who they couldn't control. Still, he hadn't expected it to escalate the way it did. Not until the night of the gas can. It was a quiet Thursday. Ethan had just finished reviewing case files for a consultancy project when he heard it, a faint shuffling outside. Not loud, but just off enough to trigger his instincts. He switched off his desk lamp and moved toward the window. And there she was. Marla Kensington. No clipboard. No blazer. Just a dark sweater, hair tied back, a red gas can in her hand. Ethan's stomach clenched. She moved methodically, pouring the gasoline along the hood of his sedan, then across the driver's side. Her motions were robotic. Rehearsed. Like this wasn't her first time considering it. Ethan grabbed his phone, hit record. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a lighter. And that was it. He burst through the front door. "Drop it." She froze, flame ready to strike. For a moment, the only sounds were crickets and the quiet crackle of the lighter's flame hovering in the cool air. "You don't belong here," she said, voice flat. Ethan took a step closer. "And you just made sure you don't either." He raised his phone. "You're on camera. Every second of this." Marla's eyes flicked to the screen. The mask slipped. For the first time, she looked unsure. "Not sorry." Not scared. Just uncertain. Like reality was beginning to crack through the delusion she'd built. Then, without a word, she ran. The lighter fell to the pavement with a sharp clack. The flame sputtered, caught briefly on a streak of gasoline, but died out before it could spread. Ethan stood in silence for a long moment, the smell of fuel heavy in the air. Then he crouched, took photos, and made a call. Not to 911. To someone higher. He had no intention of giving Marla a chance to spin this as a misunderstanding. By the time the SUVs arrived the next morning, Ethan was ready. But what he hadn't expected, what stayed with him, was what happened just before the cuffs. When Marla Kensington, still composed in slacks and silk, looked across the street and hissed, "You did this." It wasn't the accusation that struck him. It was the look in her eyes. Like she still believed the system would protect her. Like she was still the queen of Cedar Glen, and he was the outsider with dirt on his shoes. That moment stuck with him. Even now, after her removal, after the interviews, after the neighborhood had begun to breathe again, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about that one truth: people like Marla don't fall easily. And when they do, they don't fall alone. A week later, a formal letter arrived from the interim board. "We're conducting a full audit of past fines, enforcement records, and complaints issued under Ms. Kensington's tenure. If you were subject to any questionable citations, please submit documentation for review." Ethan smirked. He had a folder already prepared. But he didn't submit it for himself. He walked next door to Mr. Jensen, the retired widower who'd been fined 3 times for letting his grandkids draw on his sidewalk with chalk. "Let's start with you," Ethan said, handing him a form. The man's hands trembled as he took it. "She told me it made the neighborhood look childish." Ethan smiled. "That's the idea." The battle with Marla Kensington wasn't over the lawn, the signs, or the gas can. It was over dignity. Over the right to exist in a community without fear of surveillance or selective justice. And in the end, she had lost. Not because she'd been caught. But because people stopped being afraid. Part 5. The neighborhood reclaims itself. The news trucks left as quickly as they came. Within days, Marla Kensington's arrest had fallen out of rotation, replaced by stories of city budget meetings and high school sports scores. But the effects of her downfall hadn't vanished. They lingered in Cedar Glen's sidewalks, porches, and daily conversations. Something fundamental had shifted. And Ethan Reed could feel it in the stillness. No more surprise citations tucked under doormats. No more anonymous complaints about minor landscaping issues. No more early morning knocks from inspectors acting on mysterious tips. Just quiet. And healing. The interim HOA board wasted no time cleaning house. They sent out surveys asking residents about past violations, enforcement inconsistencies, and whether they'd ever felt unfairly targeted. The inbox overflowed within 48 hours. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other started sharing stories. Tales of warnings for bird feeders, notices about children's sidewalk chalk, passive-aggressive threats hidden behind bureaucratic language. People who'd lived side by side for years were finally saying what they'd always thought. Marla made it hard to feel at home. Ethan attended the first open forum held by the new board. It wasn't fancy. Just a circle of folding chairs in the community center. But the space felt different, no longer a courtroom of judgment, but a place for truth. An older woman named Margaret Sue, who lived near the cul-de-sac, stood up with a manila folder full of old violation letters. "She fined me 3 times for my roses growing over regulation height," she said, voice trembling. "They were my late husband's favorite. I stopped growing them after that." Ethan leaned forward. "Start again." She blinked. Then smiled, small, grateful. The next morning, as Ethan stepped out to collect his mail, he noticed a small planter box sitting on his porch. Nestled inside, a fresh rosebush. Deep red. No card. No name. Just a quiet thank you. Throughout Cedar Glen, things began to change, not loudly, but with purpose. A teenager repainted his mailbox bright blue, no longer fearing a fine. A family strung solar lights along their porch railing, letting them blink joyfully after sunset. Mr. Jensen's grandkids returned, chalk in hand, covering his driveway with rockets and butterflies and crooked hearts. And no one said a word about it, except to say, "Nice work." Ethan hadn't set out to become anything more than a man defending his home. But people began seeking him out, not because he was loud, but because he had stood when no one else would. One afternoon, a soft knock came on his door. Standing there was Jonas Ellison, a young father who'd just moved in months before the chaos unfolded. "I've been thinking about running for the HOA board," Jonas said. "But I've never done anything like that. I'm not, you know, political." Ethan leaned on the doorway. "Good. We've had enough of politics." Jonas laughed. "Any advice?" "Yeah," Ethan said. "Don't focus on control. Focus on connection." He paused. "And never issue a citation for sidewalk chalk." Weeks passed. The roses bloomed. The chalk art spread. The rules were rewritten, this time with community input. And Ethan found peace not in victory, but in watching a place slowly remember how to be a neighborhood again. Then, one morning, a small package arrived on his doorstep. No return address. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, Cedar Glen HOA membership application. A yellow sticky note attached read, "Membership not required. But welcomed." The interim board. Ethan stared at it for a long time. Then, for the first time, he didn't rip it in half. He set it on the kitchen table. And poured himself another cup of coffee. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted Cedar Glen in amber light, Ethan walked the block. Neighbors waved. Kids laughed. A couple argued gently about whether to install a hammock. Normal. Warm. Human. He passed Marla Kensington's house, now silent and empty. The blinds drawn. The lawn slightly overgrown. The fountain turned off. Her kingdom abandoned. And in its place, life. The lesson wasn't just about standing up to a bully. It was about taking back the right to belong. Cedar Glen didn't need perfection. It needed people willing to show up, speak up, and leave the gate open for others to do the same. Ethan Reed had come to Cedar Glen for peace. He'd stayed to help others find it too. Part 6, What Belongs to Everyone. 3 months had passed since Marla Kensington's arrest, and her house still stood empty. Like a relic of another time. The shutters were closed, the lawn faded, and the once silent fountain out front now bubbled again, turned on by the interim board as a quiet act of reclamation. But no one looked at it with reverence anymore. To most, it was a symbol of what had been, and what would never be again. Ethan Reed walked the curved streets of Cedar Glen with a calmness he hadn't known in months. Children played tag in open yards, a couple painted their fence together, and music from someone's porch speaker drifted across the air, Frank Sinatra, if he wasn't mistaken. The neighborhood had settled, not into silence, but into something more meaningful. Freedom. Not the kind waved on flags or quoted in speeches, but the real kind, the ability to breathe deeply in your own home without fear of someone watching for a reason to punish you. Earlier that morning, the final email from the HOA's transitional committee had landed in Ethan's inbox. Subject, Final Board Results. Welcome new leadership. Dear residents, we are pleased to announce the results of Cedar Glen's first open HOA election. Your new board members are Jonas Ellison, President, Margaret Sue, Vice President, Carlin Gwynn, Secretary. Thank you to all who voted, volunteered, and believed in a better way forward. Ethan had voted, quietly, and stepped back. He never once considered running. He didn't want power. He wanted balance. And now, it seemed, Cedar Glen had found it. Later that day, as he tended to his front garden, a familiar figure approached, Jonas Ellison, clipboard in one hand, a humble grin on his face. "Mind if I bug you for a minute?" Jonas asked. Ethan stood, brushing soil from his palms. "Bug away." Jonas handed him a small packet. "We're working on something new. A community charter. Nothing legal, just shared values. What this place should stand for. Before we make it public, we wanted your eyes on it first." Ethan flipped through the draft. It wasn't perfect. But it didn't have to be. Because it was written in hope, not fear. "I like it," Ethan said, then looked up. "Especially the part about protecting chalk art." Jonas chuckled. That was Claire's addition. Her daughter insists on a rainbow driveway now. "Good," Ethan said. "Let her color the whole street." That night, as twilight settled, Ethan sat on his porch sipping tea, legs stretched comfortably. He watched porch lights flicker on one by one, like stars coming alive. His phone buzzed once, a message from a neighbor thanking him, for speaking up, for staying, for not letting silence win. He put the phone down without replying. Not because it didn't mean something. But because it wasn't about him anymore. Meanwhile, across town, the legal proceedings against Marla Kensington moved on quietly. She had pleaded no contest to reduce charges, sparing the courts a long public trial. Her lawyer cited stress, concern for community standards, and a passionate but misguided attempt to enforce neighborhood order. No one bought it. She was fined, placed on probation, and barred from holding any leadership position in a housing organization for 5 years. The fountain she had installed was now a shared garden space. The bench beside it bore a new plaque, "In memory of what we overcame, Cedar Glen." Together 1 week later, Ethan received a small envelope in the mail. Inside was a copy of the finalized Cedar Glen Community Charter and a typed note: "We may never all agree on flowers, fences, or mailbox colors, but we agree on one thing: no one should live in fear of where they live. Thank you for reminding us." Ethan folded the note and placed it in the drawer beside the old violation letters, the ones he'd saved not for vengeance, but as a reminder. A reminder that people forget easily, until someone makes them remember. As summer crept into the edges of the calendar, Cedar Glen flourished, not just in flowers and grass, but in spirit. It no longer whispered of control behind closed doors. It spoke of shared space. Shared trust. And the kind of leadership that doesn't demand obedience, but invites participation. Ethan Reed had never asked to be the center of anything. But in choosing not to shrink, he'd helped something larger than himself bloom. Not a revolution. A restoration. Of voice. Of fairness. Of home. And on warm evenings, when chalk drawings still sprawled across the sidewalks and wind chimes tinkled freely in the breeze, Ethan would sit on his porch with a smile and know, Cedar Glen finally belonged to everyone. And that was enough. In life, some people mistake control for leadership. They wrap fear in policy, hide cruelty behind structure, and believe power is their birthright. But eventually, the truth has a way of rising. The story of Cedar Glen reminds us that real leadership doesn't come from rules or intimidation, it comes from integrity, humility, and respect for others. For too long, Marla Kensington controlled her neighborhood not with fairness, but with fear. She silenced voices, divided neighbors, and thrived on compliance. But when one man chose to stand up, not with rage, but with quiet courage, the entire community began to remember its strength. Ethan Reed didn't seek power. He simply refused to surrender his dignity. And that single act lit the path for change. What followed wasn't a dramatic uprising, it was the slow, beautiful rebuilding of a place once ruled by silence. That's how real change often begins. With one person willing to do the right thing when it's inconvenient, when it's uncomfortable, and when everyone else is looking the other way. This story is not just about a neighborhood. It's about every place where someone feels voiceless, unwelcome, or watched. And it reminds us, especially those who have lived through generations of struggle, that fear only wins when good people say nothing. Speech Balloon, if this story spoke to you, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your voice. And if you believe more people should hear stories like this, please like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss the next powerful reminder of what's worth standing up for.